Personally, I think it would have been better to dedicate a chapter to each one of these religions, but the author saw fit to combine the two faiths into one chapter. However, I think I would prefer to separate the lectures into two parts, one solely dedicated to Christianity and another lecture solely dedicated to Buddhism. And so this first lecture will deal with Chapter 8 only on Christianity, and then I'll add a Part 2 lecture as well. Now, the Greco-Roman background is important to understand when it comes to Christianity, because Christianity emerged out of three distinctly different cultural traditions, one being Greco-Roman, the other being Near Eastern or West Asian, and the third being Hebraic. But to be more succinct, the historical setting for the New Testament in early Christianity may be described as a series of concentric circles. The Roman world provided the outer circle, the governmental, legal, and economic context. The Greek world provided the cultural, educational, and philosophical context. The Jewish world was the matrix of early Christianity, providing the immediate religious context. Palestine itself, already Hellenized, was the home of Jesus and the first disciples in the setting of Jesus' ministry. The diaspora synagogues provided the most important points of entry for Christianity into the wider Greco-Roman world. While it may be challenging to look at this period and see syncretism or blending and borrowing of imagery and ideals, it must be stated from a history of ideas perspective, Christianity could only emerge from a time period within a context of existing ideas. It could not emerge any other way, or it would then cease to be historical. The book touches on the similarities and avoids the painstaking process of highlighting the unique characteristics of Christianity and the complexities of its theology, and in all fairness, rightly so. After all, this course is an introduction to the humanities, and to do more would surely neglect the introductory nature of this course. There is undoubtedly a shroud of myth and mystery around true historical Christianity. Moreover, it would be to truly neglect scholarship to ignore the syncretism and borrowing of imagery and ideas. But what is indeed fact is that Christianity prevailed. The victory of Christianity over paganism and mystery religions is indeed that of history over myth and allegory. Although some utterly reject any theological presuppositions about Jesus of Nazareth, they're still forced to concede that Jesus was a real man who historically lived. Over the course of time, that fact alone gave Christianity a tenacity that other religions lacked. So let's now look at the religious and mythical milieu that existed at the rise of Christianity. First, ancient pagan religious rituals are of interest because there were many celebrations that centered around these holidays found in paganism. And so the winter solstice, the celebration of seed time and harvest, paganism centers on the earth itself. So seasons changing and the solstices are phenomena that evoke awe and wonder, and they're sought after for their indispensable role in agriculture and survival. The Greek gods in the Roman culture were, like a lot of other things, appropriated by the Romans. Rome embraced the Greek gods and gave them Latin names, because as gods were actually working throughout the universe, they thought new gods were, could be discovered, and these too could be worshipped. So when the Roman legions would come back from the provinces with new gods, citizens in Rome thought it expedient to worship them. And again, as we see the influence of the theology in the Roman culture from the Greeks, Hellenistic philosophy also played a major part in this, cultural and religious context that Christianity, rose out of. And Stoicism, again, coming back up, as we've talked about this in this course already, its ethical view of life and its emphasis on equality among human beings offered an idealized alternative to a social order marked by wide gaps between rich and poor and between citizens and slaves. And just as I had mentioned in our lecture on Stoicism, we see the Apostle Paul quoting Stoic philosophers when he stood in the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17. So he would not have been ignorant at all to Stoic philosophy, being that he was a Hellenized Jew, and he was educated, and he was standing there in Athens, the heart of Greece, and he was trying to relate to the people by quoting some of their poetry, some of their Stoic philosophers, which was a wise move, really, because he was able to draw the people in and be relevant, and he knew what he was talking about. And Neoplatonism, which is pretty complex, and we'll just kind of briefly touch on it, but Neoplatonism was an elaborate system of religious and intellectual belief that was based on ideas about the One, kind of like in The Matrix, right? The One. And the One was this unseen source of all existence. As a powerful but unseen foundation for everything in existence, the One was similar to Plato's forms. Neoplatonism was a revision of Plato's main ideas, but it was able to coexist with Christianity as Rome and its empire became increasingly adverse to atheism and paganism. Neoplatonists and Christians were often at bitter odds with each other on political and religious grounds, and few people were both Christians and Neoplatonists before medieval times. Plotinus founded Neoplatonism in the 3rd century. Early Neoplatonism ended with the works of Boethius in the 6th century, his attempt was to reconcile Plato and Aristotle with Christian theology. So the point is, Neoplatonism and Stoicism were both Greek philosophies that contributed to this rich milieu of Roman thought. And then we have the presence of the Eastern traditions. And so my disclaimer is some of this stuff is graphic and a little bit weird, but there are some important things that we want to pay attention to within these descriptions of these Eastern religions, Eastern traditions, because they contribute some imagery and ideals that we see manifest in Christianity or Catholicism. And the first is the cult of Isis from Egypt. The cult of Isis originated in the Egyptian myth of the descent of the goddess Isis into the underworld to find and resurrect her brother/mate Osiris, who was murdered by his brother Seth. And yes, Osiris is the brother of Isis. She somehow puts back together the pieces of his body in the underworld after being cut into pieces by Seth and scattered across Egypt. She puts them back together and somehow conceives a child with her deceased brother husband, and they have a child named Horus. A lot of people will say this is very strikingly similar to Christianity because of a virgin birth, but as you can see, that's not really a virgin birth. It's supernatural. Something took place. It's kind of interesting, but it wasn't quite a virgin birth. But we do see in the text, you see the Isis and child, and it's strikingly similar to Madonna and child, Mother Mary, baby Jesus. And there's no reason to suspect that that definitely wasn't taken and used and appropriated in Catholicism. I mean, it's pretty obvious. In a lot of ways, it would have made Christianity and Catholicism more palatable if people were already embracing these cults. There also exist other myths about Seth, and he had this wild sexual desire for his nephew Horus. And Isis, at one point, tells Horus to pretend to have sex with his uncle, but to only merely capture his seed in his hand. And so Horus performs this act, and he brings his uncle's seed to his mother, and she cuts off his hand, discards the hand that was contaminated, and then she commences to masturbate her own son into a pot, which they then spread on Seth's garden. Seth then unknowingly eats of his garden, and then he gives birth to a radiant disc through the top of his head, which is in turn placed above the head of Horus, indicating that he is indeed the true son of the sun god. So what we should glean from this here is, for one, the semi-virgin birth, the mother and child imagery, Horus's title as the Son of God, and albeit similar, there is some obvious myth, allegory, and fantasy at play here. But nonetheless, a remnant of some of these ideas are similar to later Christian ideas. Well, little is known of the mystery cults except Apuleius's metamorphosis, aka the Golden Ass. And it holds a wealth of information about the cult of Isis, because Apuleius was himself an initiate into the cult of Isis, and therefore his information is considered reliable. The metamorphosis ends with the hero Lucius, eager to be initiated into the mystery cult of Isis. He abstains from forbidden foods, he bathes and purifies himself. Then the secrets of the cult's books are explained to him, and further secrets revealed before going through the process of initiation, which involves a trial by the elements and a journey to the underworld. Lucius is then asked to seek the initiation into the cult of Osiris in Rome, and eventually is initiated into the Pastaphoroi, a group of priests that serves Isis and Osiris. Another mystery religion, or some of a cult that is worth mentioning, is that of Cybele in Persia. Now, the cult of Cybele originated in Persia in modern-day Turkey. In 205 BC, when the outcome of the interminable war with Carthage was still in doubt and there were strange portents in the sky, the Sibylline oracles were consulted. A prophecy was found that seemed relevant and indicated that victory would be forthcoming if the Romans began to worship the great mother goddess. Accordingly, 50 former magistrates, led by Avir Optius, a best man, went to find the great mother goddess and bring her to Rome. Just how they decided that Cybele was the one they wanted is unclear, but her worship was brought to Rome, and the war with Carthage ended as well. But in fact, the actual worship of Cybele disgusted and horrified the Romans and had to be modified before it was acceptable. Now, the Phrygians believed that Cybele had a husband to a minor deity named Attis. In the course of their life together, Attis had castrated himself and bled to death. Consequently, the priests of Cybele were obligated to castrate themselves. In a state of ecstasy while dancing through the streets of town, the prospective priests would castrate themselves, then attempt to throw their severed part through someone's doorway. If they succeeded in getting inside someone's house, the people inside were obliged to help the prospective priest. If not, certain death from blood loss was probably going to happen. However, if they did not die from the castration, they would forever be a priest to Cybele, and they would dress in women's clothing. Cybele was in a temple erected for her. It was labeled that she was the mother of the gods, and some see that and say that's very similar to this moniker of the mother of God that we see with Mary. Dionysus in Greece. Now this is interesting because Dionysus and Mithra are two very strikingly similar to two religions that are very strikingly similar in many respects to some elements we see in Christianity. Dionysus actually embodied some characteristics that we see also in the life of Jesus. And the cult of Dionysus became associated with wine. But he was not actually the god of the vine alone, but of vegetation and fertility in general, except for grain, because that actually belonged to Demeter. But Dionysus was fathered by Zeus, and he had a mortal woman for a mother named Semele. Hera, which was a female consort of Zeus, ordered that baby Dionysus be torn to shreds, but he was then reassembled later by his grandmother. Hera tracks down Dionysus and afflicts him with divine madness and causes him to roam the world, spreading viniculture and revelry. And so what's important to notice here is that there's a connection to wine, although he never, I don't think in any myth we have evidence of that he ever actually turned water into wine, but there is that connection, and some see a similarity there. He has a death and resurrection, though not really, again, a very the death and resurrection is not really kind of the way you would think the story we hear about Jesus, who dies and is buried like a real human and then comes back from the dead, same way he rose other people from the dead. Dionysus, his death and resurrection are a little bit different. He's torn to pieces and he's put back together. And again, this is how the myth and the allegory now has some similar elements, and then we see some similar elements in Christianity, but again, this is very mythic based. And one discrepancy, though, that I like to bring up between Dionysus and Jesus is that Dionysus was a god of fertility, and Jesus, if he was just kind of a knockoff of Dionysus, it's interesting that Jesus never, in all of his teachings, ever addresses fertility. And so, if he was truly just a mirror image or borrowed or a syncretism, that was one element that they definitely felt the need to leave out. Mithra, from Persia, was an ancient Persian god of light, actually a sun god, by the time Mithra makes it to Rome, kind of morphs into becoming a sun god. But Mithra was an ancient Persian god of light who, according to the Avesta, would appear before sunrise and watch over the earth and firmament while riding in a chariot drawn by 4 white horses. Now, some people see that imagery of the 4 white horses. Some scholars say that's very similar, that Jesus will return on a white horse. Although, if you see inscriptions of this, it's literally like a sun etched on, it's on the back of a horse-drawn cart, and there's 4 horses pulling it, and it doesn't. Again, it looks like they're towing the sun around. And so, is it a god or a god-man, or are we really referring to the sun itself? And following the expeditions of Alexander the Great and the fusion of Greek and Eastern religious beliefs that followed his conquests, Mithra became associated with Helios, the god of light. In fact, the word sun in Greek is Helios. The cult of Mithra was introduced into the Roman Empire when Pompey returned to Rome after capturing Jerusalem, bringing captives with him who were devotees to the Persian religion, Zoroastrianism actually. Now, by the end of the 1st century, the cult of Mithra was well established, especially among Roman soldiers, and by 250 CE, it had become a major rival to Christianity. Mithra was regarded as the all-knowing god and as a deity of fertility and abundance. He was also the untiring opponent of evil who would ruthlessly destroy wickedness wherever he discovered it. And so the followers of Mithras could be purified by baptism. This is interesting here because here we see some similarities. The followers of Mithras could be purified by baptism. They honored the 7th day, Sunday, is why we call it Sunday, right? The day of the sun, and they celebrated the birth of their god on the 25th of December. Their special virtues were abstinence and self-control. They believed in the existence of a heaven for the pure and a hell for the sinful, and also in the immortality of the soul, a future judgment, and the resurrection of the dead. some very similar things here theologically that we see in Christianity. But just to make a note about December 25th, and hopefully this isn't the first time you've heard this, but Jesus wasn't actually born on December 25th. In fact, nowhere in the Bible is that date ever even mentioned. So we don't actually think, from a textual perspective, that there's any evidence that Jesus was actually born on December 25th. Now, Mithras was considered a sun god alongside the cult of Sol Invictus, whose temple was dedicated on December 25th as well, noting that that day was the birth of the unconquerable sun, S-U-N. So there's, some say, was Mithras born or was Mithras the sun? And are they referring to the temple being erected that day and dedicated on the 25th of December? Or was the sun literally born that day? And so there's a lot of ambiguity. Again, this is ancient history, and so a lot of things we have to go by are inscriptions and ancient texts that some argue are not reliable, but there is one thing for certain, that December 25th, marking the winter solstice, was very much so a day of celebration for many of the sun cults, the worship of the sun, and which was found in paganism, and it was a very important day. By the middle of the 4th century CE, Egyptian Christians in communities regularly celebrated January 6th as both the baptism and the birth of Christ, and the Armenian Church only celebrated the birth of Jesus on January 6th as well. And so this was popular in Rome, and rightly so. Like I said, we're dealing with a religion that is emerging out of a context of tons of ideas and imagery and specific dates for specific reasons. And even though the Bible doesn't explicitly say that Jesus was born on December 25th, folks had to pick a day, and it went alongside with things they already believed and embraced. And so I could see why it wouldn't be a very, crazy idea to say, well, December 25th, we'll celebrate the birth of Jesus. But the church, in fact, did not agree upon December 25th as the nativity of Jesus until the 5th century. And of course, we cannot talk about Jesus of Nazareth and his followers, who were all, in fact, Jewish in the beginning, without discussing the Jewish backgrounds of Christianity. Now, as we've already read in the book, the early Jewish tradition, states that the Jews, the Israelites, were a nomadic people. They would wander, settle, they would conquest at the hands of foreign powers, they would be held captive, they'd be let go. Fast forwarding kind of through the later part, getting close to where we are, we have the Babylonian captivity, which was 586 to 539 BCE. And then we have the Restoration period, which follows, which was 539 to 400 BCE. And this was considered the Persian period, because they were allowed to go and rebuild the temple. So they returned to Jerusalem in 539. 516, they rebuild the temple. And then we have what is known as the intertestamental era or period. And this is what we would call the 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. So basically, Malachi has the last word, and then we don't have any other. And this is, up for debate, because we clearly have the Septuagint, which was written, and some of the apocryphal books that were written in that period, which shouldn't be discounted entirely for their literary and cultural value and insight into Hellenistic Judaism. But we have this period that Christians basically call the intertestamental period. It's an era between the Old and the New Testament. But it was really what it was the Hellenistic period. Because this is when the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, emerges. And Jews at this point are dwelling in a province called Judea. And now at this time, we have 3 sects of Judaism that are important to the rise of Christianity. Mostly the Pharisees and Sadducees are important because New Testament literature addresses those two sects. And then there were also the Essenes. Now the Pharisees believed in the immortality of the soul, and they believed in the resurrection. And the Sadducees, they did not believe in the resurrection. And there's a way to remember the difference between the two. It's sad, you see, they did not believe in the resurrection. And so the Pharisees believed, and it was sad, you see, because the Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection. In fact, there is one part in the New Testament, one of the Gospels, when one of the Sadducees is trying to catch Jesus and put him in a kind of a bind and asks him about whose wife will belong to a certain man who marries and remarries, and brother dies and another brother marries, and who in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? But they were trying to trick him because they didn't even really believe in a resurrection. So it was interesting. The Essenes were an ascetic group, and they were seeking a kind of apocalyptic Messiah, and they lived in a place called Qumran, which is where the famed Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And some contend even that John the Baptist may have been an Essene. But the major point is, in this time period, there was an expectancy that a Messiah would come. And Jesus was thought by some Jews, not actually very many, but some, that he was in fact the Messiah, the Anointed One. And that it was seen he was a kind of fulfillment of prophecy, and that he was coming to redeem Israel from the grip that Rome had on the Jews. And so rising up in this dynamic, complex system of thought and idea and Roman rule and Judaism and philosophy and all these other religions, coming along, having so much to say. I mean, there were so many gods and so many worship, forms of worship of so many gods. There was no stone left unturned. I mean, there was a vast, immense, complex, level after level of gods and worship and, philosophical ideas. And then Jesus, this, guy who was born, living, from a Palestinian, son of a carpenter, as they say, raises up, born poor, and he has these teachings. And the teachings of Jesus are found in the 4 books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there's a very small, a little touch on some things Jesus says in the beginning of Acts. The book of Acts is actually like Luke part 2. Luke wrote a 2-volume, account, the Gospel of Luke and then the Acts of the Apostle. But for some reason, throughout history, somebody decided that we would stick John in between those 2 volumes, which is interesting, and nobody really knows why. But and your text says that the Gospels were written in Greek and Aramaic, and without really qualifying that, you might think there's some Aramaic, copies of some of the books of the Bible, but really, there's only a handful of Aramaic words, and just random, not really very specific about why, but there's just a handful, literally. I mean, maybe 7 or 8. I can think of a few of them, but I won't go there right now. But not very many. But the majority, I'd say 99.9% of the New Testament, is in fact written in Koine Greek. But the life and teachings of Jesus are found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Jesus' ministry basically begins when he's baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist, and the Holy Spirit descends like a dove, and a voice, sounds from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And from that point forward, Jesus begins his, what some would say his earthly ministry or whatever. And it's about a 3-year period. And Jesus, he claimed to be the completion of the Hebrew law. He said the law and the prophets, like I've not come to do away with the law, but to fulfill the law. And so he kind of, instead of this rigid obedience to the law, he really drove at the heart of the spirit of the law. What does it really mean to keep the law? And he would say it means to love God and love your neighbor. It wasn't that to keep the perfect law was going to get you into heaven. In fact, I think if whatever he proved essentially was that there would be nobody who could actually do that. And Jesus set the standard pretty high I would say, to discount the efforts of the really religious Pharisees and the Sadducees who were all about keeping the law, but they missed to the heart of what it meant to follow Yahweh. And so his message was a message of reform to his fellow Jews. And according to the scripture, the Sanhedrin, the Jews, had Jesus brought basically before Rome. And historically, there's a little bit of, the Jews didn't have enough authority to actually commit to have him crucified. Of course, it would have to be a decision made by Rome. And so, a lot of, unfortunately, anti-Semitic beliefs that have kind of carried over through the last 2,000 years is that the Jews killed Jesus. And I wouldn't say they were absolutely blameless. And when you read the text, they apparently, according to the scriptures, according to the Gospels, they played a part in it. But ultimately, the reality is Jesus was crucified by Rome for his threat to the stability of the empire. If he shows up flipping tables in Jerusalem, that's probably a pretty threatening thing to do, since the temple didn't actually belong to the Jews. It belonged to Rome. That's why they collected taxes there. And, so it's a complex thing historically, because really at the end of the day, Jesus was crucified by Rome. Now, with the end of kind of the Jesus period, so to speak, we have the rise of the Apostle Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, which we see in the book of Acts, and then the epistles, the letters that Paul wrote to the churches, some of which we think are authentic, and some of which are debated scholarly whether he did or did not write them. Or if they were forgeries. There's an extensive amount of research out there about these things, stacks of volumes if you ever care to read them. There's no shortage on that stuff. But it's not really within the scope of this, so we won't really go into it. In fact, in the text, they handle it pretty judiciously, and they say 10 to 15 of the letters in the New Testament were attributed to Paul, which is a pretty big span. So they think about 5 of them were not letters Paul actually wrote, that somebody else may have written and put Paul's name on it. But Paul, he was from a place called Tarsus. Now, Paul himself was a Pharisee, actually, according to his own admission. He was a Pharisee of the tribe of Benjamin, considered himself blameless according to the law, and he was a persecutor of Christians. So when you look in the book of Acts, there's the stoning of Stephen, and it says that a young man, Paul, was there, and they laid their jackets at his feet while they stoned Stephen. So Paul, before he becomes Paul, is named Saul, and Saul is a persecutor of the church who sets out on his way to Damascus. He has this supernatural encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. This, encounter occurs, and he has this vision, or he claims Jesus appears to him, knocks him off his horse and blinds him. When he gets to Damascus, he's a different person. And so a guy who set out to go and kill Christians and bring them to judgment and persecute them ended up being converted on his way to do something like that, and then in turns just totally radically reconstructs the religion. I mean, he takes the works of Jesus and what Jesus taught, and then he systematizes it, and he really gives the right conduct for the church in his letters, the way they should act, the way they should conduct their meetings, and he really lays out a systematic theology of the role and function that Jesus served. For Paul, the death of Jesus was the act of atonement that acquitted humankind of original sin. So where Adam's sin had condemned humankind, Jesus was this new Adam that would redeem humankind. His resurrection confirmed the promise of eternal salvation. So putting faith in Jesus, Paul promised that the faithful will be rewarded with everlasting life. They would be brought up in the resurrection in the final day, and they would be reunited with Jesus in the air. And this was a radical message because a lot of the things that Paul goes on to systematize were not really things found in the teachings of Jesus. And there's a lot of this scholarly debate out there about the difference between the gospel of Jesus and the gospel of Paul, that somehow Paul had another version of Christianity than the one Jesus taught. Of course, your more conservative scholars would say we kind of see that as two different parts of the same puzzle. But the spread of Christianity was not actually very successful before Paul. And some scholars estimate about 10 to 15% actually received Christianity. But it was by Paul's efforts that the religion of Christianity spread with such great success. And of course, you can't really, the success of Christianity, you can't really ignore the political function that Rome serves in how this message goes forth with such success. Because we do talk about Mithras, we do talk about Dionysus, we see a lot of similarities, we see Isis, but the reality we're forced to confront is that, other than maybe a few smatterings of small cult followings around the world, obviously Christianity won. But why? And so there's some socioeconomic issues, there's some theological issues about why, and there's some political issues, some purely political reasons why Christianity flourished. And for one, the decline of the Roman Republic created a wide discrepancy between the rich and the poor. And so there was injustice. There was oppression of the poor. Jesus came and he brought a message, and it was about, I've come to preach the gospel to the poor. And so finally there's this message, this religious belief that wasn't for the elite, it wasn't for the high class, it was accessible to all men and women, whether you were rich or poor. And so this gospel was for everyone, for Jews, Gentiles, slaves, free, rich and poor. The message of the gospel of Christianity was for anyone. And actually, the role of women in Christianity was rather progressive. Now, you kind of have to read a little bit between the lines to see this, but at one point Jesus mentions, in one of the Gospels, it mentions that there were women who helped fund Jesus' ministry. Just even the role we see that he had women disciples, followers, Mary Magdalene, Mother Mary, Peter's mother, and just the interaction we see with these women was actually extremely progressive for this patriarchal system of Judaism, even in Rome and in these Greco-Roman era where women were again extremely oppressed. There was this accessibility for women that was really radical, and there's a ton of scholarship out there about this stuff. If you're ever interested, you can email me and I will direct you towards some of it. And then there's the historical credibility, because like I stated in the beginning, the one thing that separates Christianity, or even to say Islam, is that a guy named Muhammad lived, right? With, Islam, we know that, and look at the success of that religion. We look at Christianity, there's something that is to be reconciled when you say the person that this religion is about was a real person. They really lived. Now, of course, when it comes to Jesus or even Muhammad or any man or human being that lived and claimed a religious, to claim to be from God as a prophet or a Messiah or whatever, that part requires faith on the person following the religion. But knowing that it's putting faith in a human and not some mystical, allegorical figure that might have actually been the sun or, a bird or something, there's something powerful in that. And that aided in the spread of Christianity. And another thing that we have to address is the conversion of the Emperor Constantine to Christianity. Now, the book just sort of handles that and treats it, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. And yes, there's some debate. In fact, it's not entirely clear at what point Constantine converts to Christianity, as some scholars say. According to Eusebius, Constantine converted to Christianity at the time of his heavenly vision, and he has this dream, and he sees the cross in the sky before the sun, and that was before the Battle of Milvian Bridge in October of 312. Now, some say the Roman Emperor Constantine didn't actually convert to Christianity until he was on his deathbed in 337. So there's a little bit of debate about this, but what is clear, and this is what is important, is that he was, whether he was Christian or not, he helped facilitate laws that protected Christianity. In 313 CE, Constantine establishes the Edict of Milan, which stated that all religions were now legal within his Western Roman Empire. Now, however, the Edict of Milan did not end Christian persecution taking place in the rest of the Roman Empire, but it was a first step forward. And a lot of people give credit to Constantine, that, Constantine became a Christian and he made Christianity the national religion of Rome, and that's not entirely true. In fact, a guy who gets kind of pushed a little bit to the side for whatever reason, I don't know, he wasn't popular enough to really be mentioned in some of the movies we've seen about this topic, but it was Theodosius. In 380, he declared that Nicene Christianity, that was Christianity that they established these essential doctrines at the Council of Nicaea, that the Nicene Christianity was the one true faith, and then he threatened dissenters with legal penalties. And so at this point, in 380, is actually when Christianity becomes this national religion of the Roman Empire, also known as Catholicism, which means universal. And that is Christianity in a nutshell, its rise out of the Greco-Roman background with its influences from Judaism and the Eastern religions and all of the complex Hellenistic philosophies that contributed to these ideas. And this is how Christianity rose up, and as we'll see as we move forward through this course, it dominated. So thank you for listening.